Earthborn. Try again.
That's impossible, Dad.
She caught it. She caught the scanner bolt. No colony-born could survive that.
The air smelled of burnt copper and sour sweat. When the scanner bolt snapped across the room, a lethal streak of blue light meant to paralyze, she didn't flinch. Her calloused hand snapped up. The bolt sizzled against her bare palm. Smoke drifted. She smiled, teeth bared. Earthborn. Try again. The orbital tether processing center always tasted like old pennies and recycled breath. Harper stood in line 14, shifting her weight from her left leg to her right, trying to ignore the deep, familiar ache in her kneecaps. Station gravity was a meager 0.8 Gs, a soft, floating sensation that made the locals walk with a bouncy arrogance. To Harper, it just made her joints feel loose, like a poorly assembled machine missing a handful of critical bolts. She scratched at the edge of her collar. The synthetic fabric of her jacket chafed against the burn scar on her neck. Ahead of her, a slow, shuffling mass of off-worlders pushed their luggage through the magnetic rings. The ambient sound was a dull, unending thrum of life support systems overlaid with the sharp, intermittent chirps of identity scanners. Next, a voice barked. Harper stepped up to the yellow line painted on the scuffed permacrete floor. Behind the plexiglass barrier stood a cadet. He couldn't have been older than 20, his uniform crisp and utterly devoid of the grease stains or fraying threads that came with actual work. His name tag read, Wyatt. He had the pale, elongated features of a third-generation colonist. Too tall, bones too light. Passport and biocodes, Wyatt demanded, not looking up from his console. His voice cracked slightly on the second word. Harper slid her datapad through the narrow slot. She watched Wyatt's long, spindly fingers tap against the glass screen. A moment later, the console flashed a harsh, warning amber. Wyatt's posture stiffened. The boredom vanished, replaced instantly by the rigid, hyper-vigilant panic of someone who had read the training manuals but never been in a bar fight. Origin world, Wyatt said, his tone dropping an octave as he tried to sound authoritative. It's on the screen, kid, Harper replied. Her voice was gravelly dry from the station's over-filtered air. State your origin world for the audio log, Wyatt insisted, his hand dropping casually but entirely too fast to the sidearm holstered at his hip. It was a standard pacification pistol. It fired a kinetic scanner bolt, a concentrated mass of hard light and electrical current designed to lock down the nervous system of an adult male in an instant. Harper let out a long, slow breath. The smell of the station, that metallic, stale odor, seemed to thicken. Earth, the word hung between them. It always did. In the wider colonies, Earth wasn't just a planet, it was a containment zone. It was a high-gravity, high-density rock churning with erratic weather, toxic microenvironments, and a biosphere that actively tried to kill its inhabitants. The people who survived it were biologically identical to the colonists, yet fundamentally different. Denser bones, thicker muscle fibers, a central nervous system wired for constant, low-level warfare. Purpose of visit to Station 4? Wyatt asked. He took a half-step back, putting more distance between himself and the plexiglass. Transit. I'm catching the hauler to the outer belt in 3 hours. Harper reached into her inner jacket pocket to pull out her transit ticket. It was a slow, deliberate movement, but Wyatt's eyes dilated. His heart rate must have spiked. Harper could see the pulse jumping frantically in his thin neck. He saw the scarred, heavy-set woman from the death world reaching inside her coat. He didn't see a passenger. He saw a predator. "Keep your hands visible," Wyatt shouted, drawing the pistol. The people in the adjacent lines gasped. Some ducked. The low hum of the station was instantly shattered by the shrill whine of the pistol's capacitor charging. Harper froze, her hand still inside her jacket. She didn't raise her hands. She just stared at him, her dark eyes narrowing. "Put it down, Cadet. It's a paper ticket." "I said hands where I can see them." Wyatt's hands were shaking. The targeting laser danced erratically across Harper's chest, painting a tiny, jittery red dot over her sternum. He's going to pull it, Harper thought. The realization wasn't born of fear, but of a deep, exhausting annoyance. She could read the tension in his forearms. He was scared, and scared people with guns were painfully predictable. She didn't try to dodge. At 0.8 Gs, she probably could have, but the physical math in her head told her the collateral damage of dodging might hit the elderly colonist cowering 2 feet behind her. Instead, as Wyatt's finger clamped down on the trigger, Harper pulled her hand from her jacket and moved. The sound of the shot was a sharp crack, followed by the tearing hiss of displaced air. The blue kinetic bolt erupted from the barrel, meant to strike her chest and dump 50,000 volts into her nervous system. Harper's right hand whipped upward. It wasn't a graceful movement. It was violent, ugly, and fast, a reflex bred from a lifetime of catching, falling, scaffolding, dodging industrial kickbacks, and surviving the crushing gravity of a world that refused to coddle her. Her palm slammed into the bolt mid-air. The impact sounded like a wet firecracker. The kinetic force pushed her arm back a mere 2 inches, her boots sliding exactly half an inch on the permacrete. The electrical charge detonated against her bare skin. Blue arcs of lightning crawled up her wrist, snapping against the heavy fabric of her sleeve, before dying out into a foul-smelling wisp of ozone and singed flesh. Silence slammed back down onto the processing center. Wyatt stood frozen, his pistol still raised, his mouth slightly open. He stared at Harper's hand. Harper slowly lowered her arm. Her palm was blackened, the skin blistering instantly where the hard light had struck, but her fingers remained curled in a loose, relaxed fist. Her joints ached. Her palm felt like it had been held against a hot stove, a vicious, throbbing burn that made her want to grit her teeth until they cracked. She didn't. She didn't wince. She looked through the plexiglass, straight into Wyatt's terrified eyes. She opened her blackened hand, letting the dissipated residual energy flake away like dead ash. "Earthborn," Harper said, her voice a low, rough whisper that carried perfectly in the quiet room. "Try again." The detention room was an exercise in psychological discomfort. The walls were painted a pale, institutional gray that offered no texture. The temperature was set exactly 3 degrees too cold. The metal bench Harper sat on was bolted to the floor and lacked any contour, pressing uncomfortably against her spine. She sat alone, methodically peeling a ribbon of dead, scorched skin from the center of her right palm. It hurt. It hurt like a bastard. Underneath the stoic facade she had projected at the checkpoint, her hand was screaming. The nerve endings were misfiring, sending phantom shocks up her forearm. She wrapped a spare bit of sterile gauze she had in her pocket around the burn, pulling it tight with her teeth to apply pressure. She wasn't a superhero. The bolt had done damage, but her flesh was dense, her pain tolerance built over 4 decades on a world where a broken bone was just a Tuesday. The heavy door hissed open. A man walked in. He wore the dark blue uniform of station security, but without the nervous, starched rigidity of the cadet. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a neat, graying beard and eyes that had seen enough administrative disasters to be perpetually tired. He carried a data pad and a pair of steaming disposable cups. "I'm Officer Donovan," he said, kicking the door shut behind him. He walked over to the metal table bolted between them and set one of the cups down in front of Harper. "Synthetic chicory. Tastes like engine runoff, but it's warm." "Thanks," Harper grunted. She didn't touch the cup. Donovan sat opposite her. He placed his data pad on the table, the screen displaying a looping, silent security feed of the checkpoint incident. He watched it for a long moment, tapping a rhythm on the metal table with a blunt fingernail. "Wyatt is currently in medical receiving," Donovan said softly. "Sedated. They say he's suffering from acute psychological shock. He shot a civilian," Harper pointed out, her tone flat. "He should be in a holding cell, not a hospital bed. He shot a civilian who caught a class 4 kinetic pacification round with her bare hand," Donovan countered, looking up from the screen. His eyes locked onto hers. "Do you have any idea what the kinetic transfer of that bolt is? It hits with roughly 800 pounds of force per square inch. It shatters the ribs of a standard colonist before the electricity even stops their heart. You stopped it. You absorbed it. I have thick bones. You have an anomalous skeletal structure, hyperdense muscle mass, and a neurological reaction time that shouldn't be biologically possible without illegal cybernetics," Donovan said, reading from the pad. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But the medical scan shows no chrome, no wiring, just meat and bone. You're from Earth." You guys love pointing that out, Harper said, leaning back. The cold wall bit through her jacket. Is there a charge, Donovan? Because if this is just a biology lesson, I'm missing my hauler to the belt. Assaulting an officer, Donovan said mildly. Harper let out a harsh laugh. I didn't touch him. I didn't even draw a weapon. He fired on me. You intercepted a security ordinance. Technically, tampering with station pacification gear mid-flight. A small, cynical smile touched the corner of Donovan's mouth. I admit, the legal precedent is a bit thin. We don't exactly have a specific statute for catching a bullet. Harper finally picked up the cup of chicory. She held it in her left hand, letting the heat seep into her fingers. So, why am I here? You know, the kid panicked. You know I didn't do anything wrong. You're holding me because I scare the locals. I'm holding you because I need to understand what I'm dealing with, Donovan said, his voice losing its administrative polish, dropping into something more genuine, more exhausted. Every time one of you Earthborn comes through here, the station metrics go to hell. You break things without trying. You survive things that kill our people. The administration thinks you're all latent mercenaries. They think you're violent by nature. We're not violent by nature, Harper said quietly. She looked down at her wrapped, blistered right hand. We're surviving by necessity. You people live in bubbles, temperature controlled, gravity regulated, filtered air bubbles. If you trip here, a medical drone is there before you hit the deck. On Earth, if the pressure dome over your sector fails, you have 40 seconds to seal the bulkhead manually before the atmospheric toxicity melts your lungs. If the gravity stabilizers go out in the industrial sectors, you're carrying 300 pounds of steel on your back at 2 Gs. She leaned forward, her eyes darkening. We don't catch bullets to show off, Donovan. We do it because on Earth, if you don't catch the thing flying at your head, you die. It's not a superpower, it's scar tissue. Donovan sat silently, letting her words hang in the sterile, chilled air. He looked at her, not as a monster, but as a heavily worn tool, something reliable, but dangerous. I believe you, Donovan finally said. He reached over and tapped the datapad, turning off the looping footage of the incident. And off the record, Wyatt is a fool who has no business carrying a sidearm. His father is on the station council. That's the only reason he's wearing the uniform. Harper took a sip of the chicory. It did taste like engine runoff. So let me go. Donovan opened his mouth to reply, but before he could form a word, the heavy metal table vibrated. It wasn't a gentle hum. It was a sharp, jarring tremor that rattled the cups, splashing a few drops of hot brown liquid onto the table's surface. A second later, the sound reached them, a deep, resonant thud that seemed to reverberate through the very skeleton of the station. The bright fluorescent lights overhead flickered, whined in protest, and snapped off. Pitch darkness swallowed the room for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the dull, blood-red glow of the emergency lumen strips flickered to life along the baseboards. The air scrubbers stopped humming. The sudden silence in the ventilation shafts was deafening. Harper didn't move, but her posture changed instantly. The casual slouch vanished, her muscles coiled, her chin tucking down slightly. The air pressure in the room had just dropped. She could feel it in her ears, a subtle popping sensation. What was that? Donovan asked. His voice was tight, the administrative calm completely shattered. He stood up, slapping his hand against the door's control panel. The light on the panel was dead. Harper stood slowly. She sniffed the air. The smell of burnt copper from the checkpoint was gone. It was replaced by something else. Coolant, Harper said, and ionized atmospheric gas. Someone just blew a hole in the outer ring. Donovan pulled a comms unit from his belt. Control. This is Donovan in detention Aurelia. Status report. Static hissed from the speaker. Then, a voice, panicked and breathless, broke through. Sector 4. Breach. Multiple hostiles in the lower docking bay. They blew the primary airlock. We have armed boarders. The transmission cut out in a screech of feedback. Donovan stared at the comms unit, his face pale in the red emergency lighting. He looked at the locked door, then back at Harper. The tremor she had noticed earlier in his fingers was now a full-blown shake. He was a station cop. He dealt with drunk miners and lost luggage. He didn't deal with armed boarders blowing holes in space stations. Harper set her cup down. She unbuttoned her jacket, freeing her arms for better mobility, and flexed her right hand. The burn screamed in protest, but the familiar surge of adrenaline was already flooding her system, numbing the pain. Well, Harper sighed, the cynicism heavy in her throat. I guess my hauler is delayed. The station was bleeding. Harper could feel the vibrations of the structural distress through the soles of her boots. The initial silence of the power failure had been replaced by a chaotic symphony of alarms, shrill, alternating klaxons that offered no real information, only panic. Donovan was frantically prying at the manual release lever of the detention door. The metal groaned, but the heavy blast-locking mechanism held fast. He cursed, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "It's jammed," Donovan said, wiping sweat from his forehead. The lockdown protocol engaged when the pressure dropped. "We're sealed in. Move," Harper said. She stepped up to the door. She didn't bother analyzing the internal wiring or looking for a bypass switch. She looked at the heavy steel frame, pinpointing where the locking bolts intersected with the wall housing. "It's a Class A blast door, Harper," Donovan said, a note of hysteria creeping into his voice. "You can't just—" Harper raised her left leg and drove the heel of her heavy work boot into the center of the door, right next to the locking mechanism. The impact sounded like a bomb going off in the small room. The thick metal buckled inward with a sickening screech, creating a hairline fracture along the seal. Donovan stopped talking. Harper stepped back, took a breath, and kicked it again. This time, she aimed slightly higher. The metal tore. The locking bolt, designed to withstand vacuum pressure but not localized, repeated kinetic strikes of Earthborn muscle density, sheared clean off its housing. She grabbed the edge of the bent metal with her uninjured left hand and pulled. Veins stood out like thick cords on her neck. With a horrific groan of tortured steel, the door slid back just enough to let a person slip through. "After you," Harper said, gesturing to the gap. Donovan stared at the twisted ruin of the blast door, then at Harper. He swallowed hard, squeezing sideways through the opening. Harper followed, immediately scanning the corridor. The detention block was bathed in the same bloody red light as the cell. Smoke thick, acrid, and smelling of melting insulation was drifting down the hallway from the direction of the processing center. The temperature was dropping rapidly. "They hit the lower docking bay," Donovan muttered, looking at his dead datapad. "That's 3 decks down, but the ventilation system is pulling the smoke up here." "Who are they?" Harper asked, pulling her collar up over her mouth to filter the smoke. "I don't know. Pirates. Scavengers. The outer belt has been unstable for months. Station 4 is a major fuel depot. It was only a matter of time." Donovan pulled his sidearm. It was a real firearm, not a pacification pistol like Wyatt's. A heavy slug thrower. "We need to get to the central command hub. It's heavily fortified." "No," Harper said flatly. "We need to get to the life pods. If they blew the primary airlock, the structural integrity of this ring is compromised. Central command is in the core, but if they sever the tether, you'll be trapped in a coffin." A scream echoed from the far end of the corridor. It was high, desperate, and abruptly cut short by the heavy thump-thump-thump of kinetic suppression fire. Donovan flinched. Harper didn't. Her brain was rapidly processing the sound. 3-round burst, heavy caliber, military surplus, mercenaries, not just scavengers. "They're moving up," Harper stated, her voice devoid of panic. It was the same tone one might use to note it was starting to rain. "We have to help them," Donovan said, taking a step toward the smoke. Harper grabbed his shoulder, stopping him dead. "You're a middle-aged security guard with a 6-shot revolver. They have heavy kinetic rifles. You walk down there, you die. We go to the pods." "I took an oath to protect this station," Donovan snapped, tearing his shoulder away from her grip. "And I paid for a transit ticket, but we don't always get what we want," Harper shot back. "Listen to me, Donovan. You are soft. This station is soft. Those people down there are not. If you want to survive the next 10 minutes, you follow the woman who grew up on a rock that tries to kill her every day. Understand?" Before Donovan could argue, a figure stumbled out of the smoke ahead of them. It was Wyatt. The cadet was covered in soot, his crisp uniform torn and stained with something dark and wet. He wasn't wearing his pacification pistol anymore. He was clutching his left arm, his face a mask of pure terror. He saw Donovan and half ran, half fell toward them. Sir, they just came through the ceiling. They blew the floor grate in medical and just started shooting. Wyatt fell to his knees, coughing up black smoke. Donovan knelt beside him, checking his wound. Shrapnel. It's shallow. He looked up at Harper. Medical is between us and the pod bay. Harper swore under her breath, a long, creative string of Earth slang that involved atmospheric pressure and bodily fluids. She looked down the corridor. The smoke was getting thicker. The smell of blood was starting to mix with the ozone. She looked at Wyatt, crying on the floor, and Donovan, out of his depth. She hated this. She wasn't a hero. She just wanted to get to the outer belt, find a quiet mining gig, and be left alone. But the universe, it seemed, had a sick sense of humor. She knelt next to Wyatt and grabbed the tactical webbing off his chest, yanking hard. The clasps broke. She pulled a heavy, cylindrical object from one of the pouches. A thermal breach charge. Standard station emergency equipment for blowing stuck bulkheads. "What are you doing?" Wyatt choked out. "Adjusting the plan," Harper said, standing up. She weighed the charge in her good hand. "If they're in medical, they're blocking the main artery to the pods. We can't go through them." She looked at the solid permacrete wall to their left. "So, we go around them." "That's a load-bearing wall," Donovan said, his eyes widening. "Behind that is a maintenance shaft. It's a straight drop of 60 feet. "I know," Harper said. "Station schematics are public record." She walked to the wall, planted the thermal charge against the seam, and set the timer for 5 seconds. "Cover your ears and open your mouths," Harper ordered, turning her back to the wall and dropping to a crouch. Donovan grabbed Wyatt and pulled him down. The explosion wasn't a fiery blast. It was a localized, concussive wave of intense heat that melted the permacrete instantly. The wall blew outward, sucking the smoke from the corridor into the dark void of the maintenance shaft. Harper stood up, dusting debris from her jacket. The red emergency lights cast long, twisted shadows across her face. She looked at the two terrified station dwellers, the burn on her hand throbbing in time with her pulse. "Welcome to my world," Harper said. "Try to keep up." The maintenance shaft smelled like a century of forgotten labor. It was a vertical tomb of oxidized copper, stagnant air, and the sharp, chemical tang of industrial lubricant. Harper stood at the jagged edge of the blown wall, staring down into the oppressive blackness. The red emergency lighting from the corridor barely penetrated the gloom, painting the first 10 feet of the iron access ladder in a bloody hue before surrendering to the dark. "You want us to climb down that?" Donovan asked. His voice was a thin, reedy scrape against the silence. "I want you to survive," Harper replied, not looking back at him. "The ladder is your best statistical probability of doing that." She grabbed the rusted iron rail with her left hand. The metal was freezing, a biting cold that seeped instantly through her calluses. She didn't use her right hand. The burn from Wyatt's kinetic bolt was a screaming, throbbing mess wrapped in dirty gauze. The skin underneath felt tight, weeping clear fluid that made the fabric stick to her raw flesh. Every time she clenched her jaw, phantom electricity sparked up her forearm, a cruel reminder that her nervous system was still deeply confused by the trauma. She swung her body into the void. At 0.8 Gs, the drop didn't pull at her stomach the way Earth's gravity would. It felt sluggish. Wrong. Like swimming in syrup. "Get on the ladder, kid," Harper barked, looking up at Wyatt. The cadet was shivering, clutching his bleeding arm, his face pale and slick with greasy sweat. "I can't," Wyatt whispered. He took a step back. "It's too dark. My arm." "Your arm is bleeding. Your legs work fine," Harper interrupted. She didn't raise her voice, but the absolute lack of sympathy in her tone hit harder than a shout. "If you stay up there, the guys with the kinetic rifles are going to put a hole through your chest. The dark won't hurt you. Metal and hard light will move. Donovan pushed the boy forward, his own face tight with fear. Go, Wyatt. I'm right above you. Wyatt scrambled onto the ladder, his boots slipping clumsily on the rungs. His breath was a rapid, wet wheeze that echoed down the narrow concrete pipe. Donovan followed, holstering his heavy slug thrower to free his hands. Harper began the descent. The darkness swallowed them whole. She counted the rungs by feel. The texture of the iron changed as they went deeper from dry and flaky with rust, to slick with condensation, to coated in a thick, foul-smelling grease that coated her palm. 50 feet, Harper called up softly. The sound of her voice bounced weirdly off the circular walls. Above her, Wyatt whimpered. Then, a sickening scrape of rubber against wet iron. I slipped, Wyatt screamed, the sound tearing through the cramped space. Harper didn't think. She didn't weigh the options. Instinct, forged on a planet where a moment's hesitation meant being crushed by falling debris, took over. She hooked her left arm around the ladder rung, bracing her boots against the slippery iron sides of the shaft, and reached up with her right hand. Wyatt's falling boot slammed into her injured palm. The pain was a white-hot explosion behind Harper's eyes. It was absolute and blinding. The impact tore the blistering skin on her palm completely open, ripping the gauze away. She let out a guttural, wet grunt, her teeth grinding so hard she tasted copper, but her fingers closed around the thick rubber sole of his boot like a vice. The sudden stop jerked her left shoulder hard, the joint popping audibly in the dark. She held him. 160 pounds of terrified colonist hung suspended, supported entirely by her burned hand and the hyper-dense muscle of her right arm. Got you, she hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed agony. Oh God, oh God. Wyatt sobbed in the dark. Stop crying and find the rung, Cadet, Harper ordered. Her arm trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer, overwhelming wave of pain signals her brain was trying to ignore. I'm not letting go, but you need to find the rung. Wyatt's other foot kicked wildly in the dark, finally connecting with solid iron. He hauled his weight back onto the ladder. Harper released his boot. She pulled her right hand back, cradling it against her chest. Her breath came in short, jagged pants. The darkness hid the blood dripping from her hand, but she could smell it rich, metallic, and heavy. You okay down there? Donovan called down, his voice shaking. Just peachy, Harper gasped, spitting a wad of saliva into the void to clear the taste of pain from her mouth. Keep moving. They climbed for what felt like an hour, though Harper's internal clock clocked it at barely 12 minutes. The temperature steadily rose as they neared the lower engineering decks. The smell of grease gave way to the heavy, suffocating scent of ozone and burning plastic. Stop, Harper whispered. She paused on the ladder. Below them, a thin crack of pale, flickering light outlined a ventilation grate. She pressed her ear against the cold metal wall. Through the thick permacrete, she heard it. Heavy boots, deliberate, synchronized footsteps, not the chaotic shuffling of panicked colonists. This was the disciplined march of people who got paid to kill. There was a low hum of voices, distorted by the walls, followed by the terrifying, high-pitched whine of a plasma cutter chewing through metal. We're parallel to the lower docking bay, Harper said softly, looking up into the gloom. The life pods are on the other side of this maintenance corridor, but the boarders are already here. What do we do? Donovan asked. He sounded utterly exhausted. The climb had drained him. We go through, Harper said. She kicked the ventilation grate. It gave way with a loud clatter, falling into the corridor below. Harper dropped through the opening, landing in a crouch on the grated floor of the engineering deck. The gravity here felt slightly heavier, closer to a full G, as they were nearer to the station's rotational edge. It felt a little more like home. Donovan and Wyatt dropped down behind her. They were standing in a narrow corridor lined with thick, pulsing coolant pipes. At the far end of the hall, 50 yards away, a set of heavy blast doors marked the entrance to the life pod bay. Between them and the doors were 3 men. The boarders weren't simple scavengers. Harper saw that immediately. They wore matte black tactical plating, scarred and dented from previous engagements, but functionally immaculate. Their helmets featured full-face visors, glowing with heads-up displays. Two of them carried heavy kinetic rifles, the barrels still smoking from whatever they had just shot. The third was wielding the plasma cutter, trying to breach the pod bay doors. The clatter of the falling grate had alerted them. The two riflemen turned, their weapons rising in perfect, terrifying unison. "Run," Harper said. She didn't run away. She ran directly at them. Donovan yelled her name, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of kinetic fire. The corridor was narrow. There was no room to weave or dodge cleanly. The air ripped apart around her as hypersonic slugs of hard light and lead tore down the hallway. Harper threw herself sideways, diving behind a cluster of vertical coolant pipes. Sparks showered her back as the pipes absorbed the impact, the metal screaming under the kinetic force. A stray shard of shrapnel bit deeply into her left thigh. She felt the wet warmth of blood, but the pain was a distant radio station she simply tuned out. "Suppressing fire. Keep her pinned," one of the mercenaries barked. His voice was synthesized, metallic, and devoid of emotion. Harper leaned her back against the vibrating pipes. She looked at her right hand. The flesh was raw, charred, and bleeding freely. It was useless for fine motor skills. She couldn't hold a weapon with it. She couldn't throw a punch with it. She looked at the heavy, pressurized valve wheel on the coolant pipe directly above her. "Earthborn," she whispered to herself, a grim, bloody smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "Try again." She reached up with her uninjured left hand, gripped the heavy steel wheel, and yanked. The valve was designed to be turned slowly, with specialized tools, to safely release pressure. Harper didn't have tools. She had leverage and hyperdense muscle tissue. The steel groaned. She pushed off the floor with her legs, putting her entire body weight into the turn. A muscle in her back tore with an audible pop. The valve snapped. Supercooled liquid nitrogen, pressurized at 3,000 psi, erupted from the pipe. It didn't spray, it exploded. A blinding white cloud of sub-zero fog blasted down the corridor directly toward the mercenaries. The temperature dropped 80 degrees in a fraction of a second. The tactical visors of the mercenaries instantly frosted over. Their weapons, built for the vacuum of space but not sudden, localized freezing condensation, jammed as the moisture in the air crystallized inside the firing chambers. "I can't see," one of them shouted, the synthesized voice cracking with sudden panic. Harper didn't wait for the fog to clear. She launched herself out from behind the pipes. She slammed into the first mercenary before he could clear his visor. The impact of her heavy, earth-dense bones striking his armor sounded like a car crash. She drove her left elbow into the gap between his chest plate and his helmet. The reinforced collarbone beneath the armor snapped like dry kindling. He went down, choking. The second mercenary swung his heavy rifle like a club, aiming blindly in the fog. The stock caught Harper in the ribs. She felt the bone crack. The breath vanished from her lungs, replaced by a searing, blinding spike of agony. She stumbled backward, coughing up blood. The mercenary racked the slide of his jammed rifle, trying to force a round into the chamber. Harper didn't try to be precise. She lunged forward, grabbed the barrel of the rifle with her left hand, and twisted. The mercenary fought back, but he was fighting the gravity of a station dweller against the desperate, brutal strength of an Earthborn. She wrenched the weapon from his grip, reversed it, and drove the heavy metal stock into his faceplate. The visor shattered. The man crumpled. Harper dropped the rifle, her chest heaving, every breath pulling against her cracked ribs. The white fog was slowly dissipating, sucked away by the emergency ventilation fans. She turned toward the pod bay doors. The third mercenary, the one with the plasma cutter, had dropped his tool. He held a high-caliber sidearm, pointing it squarely at Harper's chest. He wasn't wearing a helmet. He had a scarred, brutal face, and his eyes were wide with a mix of shock and pure rage. He had just watched a single, unarmed woman tear through two heavily armored soldiers in under 10 seconds. "Stay down, you freak," the mercenary snarled, his finger whitening on the trigger. Harper stood perfectly still. Her left hand hung by her side. Her right hand, ruined and bleeding, was pressed against her side. She was covered in soot, frost, and her own blood. She looked at the barrel of the gun. She was so tired. The ache in her knees from the station gravity felt trivial now compared to the sharp, stabbing pain in her chest and the constant, throbbing hum of her right hand. "Drop it," a voice said. The mercenary didn't move. A deafening boom echoed through the corridor. The mercenary jerked violently forward, a massive hole blowing out the front of his tactical armor. He looked down at his chest, surprise registering on his face for a fraction of a second before his knees buckled and he collapsed onto the grated floor. Harper turned slowly, her vision swimming slightly. 30 yards down the corridor, Officer Donovan stood with both hands wrapped tightly around the grip of his heavy slug thrower. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrel. His hands were shaking so violently it was a miracle he had hit the target. Behind him, Wyatt was peering around the corner, his eyes wide. Donovan lowered the gun. He looked at the 3 bodies on the floor, then at Harper. He looked like he was going to throw up. "You hit him," Harper said. Her voice was raspy, wet with blood. "I took an oath," Donovan muttered, his voice hollow. He holstered the gun, his legs wobbling as he walked forward. "Come on." The pods. Harper limped toward the heavy blast doors. Wyatt scurried past her, punching the emergency release code into the keypad. The heavy doors hissed and slid apart, revealing a row of sleek, white escape pods. "Get in," Donovan said, ushering Wyatt into the nearest pod. The cadet scrambled inside, strapping himself into the crash seat. Donovan turned to Harper. "You're next." Harper leaned against the doorframe, her breathing shallow. She looked back down the corridor, at the ruined coolant pipe and the bodies. The station alarms were still wailing. The smell of blood and ozone was thick in her throat. "I lost my transit ticket," Harper said. It was a stupid thing to say, but her brain was starting to shut down, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving only the pain. Donovan grabbed her uninjured left arm and pulled her gently into the pod. "The company will cover it. Sit down." Harper sank into the padded seat. The material was soft, contoured, and perfect. It felt alien. She leaned her head back against the headrest, closing her eyes. "Donovan?" Harper whispered, as the officer strapped himself into the pilot's chair and hit the launch sequence. "Yeah? Remind me never to book a layover on your station again." Donovan let out a short, breathy laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Deal." The explosive bolts fired, severing the pod from the dying station. The sudden acceleration pressed Harper deep into her seat. The artificial gravity of the station vanished, replaced by the crushing, heavy G-force of the launch thrusters. Her ribs screamed. Her hand burned. Harper smiled. For the first time all day, the gravity felt exactly right. If you felt the heavy gravity of Harper's world in this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more grounded sci-fi audio dramas. We bring you tales of human grit, survival, and the gritty reality of the outer colonies every single week. Share this video with a friend who loves HFY stories where humans aren't just special, they're forged in fire. Drop a comment below on what death world you would survive. See you in the next drop, Earthborn.